So it is November 26, 2021. This is Kalyna Somchynsky, and I am in conversation today with Dr. Bohdan Krawchenko. So Dr. Krawchenko, can you quickly introduce yourself and tell us quickly about your current title?
Yeah, well, I'm Bohdan Krawchenko, and I'm currently the Dean of the Graduate School of Development of the University of Central Asia. The University of Central Asia is a regional university founded by the governments of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and His Highness the Aga Khan. We have programs and campuses in these three countries and programs in Afghanistan. Before becoming dean, I was director general of this institution, basically from its start. And so I came here the end of 2004, first to visit and short stay, and then in 2005, after I knew that the Orange Revolution would go well because of the Constitutional Court decision, thinking that I'm going to spend 3 years here, and then now we're in 2021. So it has been quite a remarkable journey. Before that, of course, I lived in Ukraine. Lived there since late 1990, early 1991, before independence. And that was a remarkable journey in and of itself. I eventually shortly became the founding director of the Institute of Public Administration and Local Government. I worked in very many government committees. I was also chair of the International Renaissance Foundation, the Soros Foundation, and did quite a lot of things. Among them, with Solomia Pavlichko, we established the publishing house of Snove, which continues to this day. And of course, before that, I was actually at the University of Alberta, where I came the same year as the Roman Petryshyn as research associates, and eventually became director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I also had a faculty appointment.
For our next question, I'm going to ask you to describe some of your most vivid memories growing up in the Ukrainian community at various points in your life. So primary school age, as a teenager, and as a young adult beginning your career.
Well, my Ukrainian community experience, of course, originated in France. My first memory, amongst my first memories, is marching with my mother in a demonstration in defense of Bohdan Krawchenko, who wrote this book, I Chose Freedom, and which was denounced by opponents as a fraud. We emigrated to Canada in 1951 and settled in Montreal, where, because I was Orthodox but French speaking, I ended up in the Montreal Protestant School Board in an all-Jewish class. I was the only Christian. Of course, my father and mother, my father in particular, was active in the Ukrainian community. And while I lived in Montreal, we were very active in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I was in Boston and went to Saturday schools and all that. But then my father had the bright idea of buying a farm when my mother and I were on holiday visiting my brother. And this was a farm in Ormstown, Quebec. So in my teenage years, I had very little contact with the Ukrainian community, except occasionally to go to St. George's Orthodox Church in Lachine, Quebec. But of course, I was very, very passionately concerned about Ukraine, and my father was a very, very specific person. We used to have raging discussions about Ukraine. I'll never forget the time once we're driving, and my girlfriend was sitting in the car, and she said, "What are you guys arguing so ferociously about?" I said, don't worry, it's actually about the what happened after Khmelnytsky and Vygotsky in the 17th century. And she thought we were complete idiots. But then I went to Bishop's University, where I was very active. In Ormstown, Quebec, I was very active. I was the only Ukrainian there. I was very active in life and in the United Church's Older Boys Parliament and this sort of thing. And I went to Bishop's University and became very active in At Bishop's University, I was the editor of the newspaper. At that time, this was the Quiet Revolution. It led all sorts of things about getting this Anglo bastion to recognize the fact that they're in Quebec. And the way in which I got connected really with the Ukrainian Canadian community again, in any kind of sense, and the only people I knew as Ukrainians were Eastern Ukrainians. I knew very few what my parents would say, that's a Halichane. So it was because Larissa Melnik came there. She was a friend of Roman Serbin. Roman Serbin was at that time, he was at UQAM, University du Québec à Montréal. And he was the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Students' Union. And she pointed out to him that they were looking for a field worker. And she said that there is this Bohdan at Bishop's who is a very active student organizer. And I was. That's what I did. And asked me to come talk to him. And of course, as somebody who was very interested and passionately committed to things Ukrainian, but never had an opportunity to be an organic member of the community, this sounded like a very good idea. The alternative was to go work for a newspaper, and well, it would have been very pleasant staying in the Eastern Townships. And so Roman said, yes, well, this is it. This is field work and it sounded to me like a great idea because it's that kind of student movement at that point, radicalism that I was very much into. And this seemed to me just like doing it within the Ukrainian community, which I knew would be very difficult to do because it's a conservative community. But I thought, what the hell? And so he said, but you have to go to Toronto and have an interview with Roman Petryshyn. And so Roman Petryshyn, I think at that time, was a civil servant in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken. And I met this very interesting guy. And he said, he told me all about this. And I said, well, this sounds very good. And he said, there's a slight downside. I said, like what? Well, we don't have any money. I said, oh, that's wonderful. But, part of it is you're going to have to raise money. And so he talked me into it. I didn't need much convincing. I was a field worker. I would end up in a place like Regina, Saskatchewan, and have 10 cents in my pocket and stayed in people's houses and God knows what. The result is I got to know everyone across the country. And of course, it ended up with that wonderful Congress that we had in Vancouver, that people of my generation, Ukrainian Canadian community, who were part of that, still talk about as a kind of very turning point event. And Roman was always there, guiding. He knew the ins and outs of the federal civil service and the provincial services, but particularly the federal services. He may have worked in Ottawa, I'm not sure. I think he worked in Toronto at that time. But he knew all about this stuff. And we, in that process, got a grant so we could hold the Vancouver Congress. And then we initiated, and I became president of the Ukrainian Canadian SUSC. I think I shocked everyone many times because I came in my full regalia of sandals and torn jeans and this sort of stuff, but the Ukrainian community was not at all prepared to. They had a tough time accepting it. And that Congress, we actually invited a broad layer of speakers, one of which was Rousseau, who was a famous Quebec anarchist, was very anti-Soviet. And just to say that people on the left are not pro-Soviet. And there was an attack on that. I attacked back. We went backstage and I said, I think Roman blew it. He said, we'll see. And I did get elected. So, and from there began a very long collaboration with Roman on getting SUS going, and especially I think, very important work that we did in reacting to the fourth volume of the Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism that dealt with bilingualism in the ethnic groups. And we, because of his efforts, and participated in writing of all of this stuff, we got a nice grant from the federal government to organize events to critique that publication. And we hired a bunch of field workers who spent the summers at various universities trying to energize and expand and mobilize Ukrainian Canadian students to join SUSC. And at that time, it was very vibrant organizations with thousands of members. And we had these conferences in various locations. And at the conference, I think we presented what I still think is a absolutely seminal and very important and very interesting statement about what multiculturalism is. I had occasion to read that. I couldn't find it. Roman Petryshyn found it in her archives. I knew I had it somewhere because all my books are still with me. And I thought to myself, my goodness, this was forward thinking. And much of that, of course, was Roman's inspiration. As a civil servant, he really couldn't say much, but he had me to do talking. I added my 2 bits as well, but it was a very articulate position. And that conference was very important, and that really was Roman's thinking. And one of the things that happened is that there was we held a conference in Edmonton, and the way in which we now were active as Ukrainian Canadians was extremely unusual for the community because we were addressing Ukrainian Canadian issues. And this captured the interest of people who were from the older, people whose parents came several generations ago. And among them was Manoli Upal, who was really outside the Ukrainian community, although he was born in that settlement area. He was a liberal, was very skeptical about the organizing community and thought we're sort of excessive nationalists, and was very surprised by our discourse. And this was the turning point for him. And of course, Manoli was a very capable person, looked up with Peter Savarin, and of course, all of these things that were accomplished. So that was a hugely important event, and I think Roman was safely say the brains behind that. I think I added energy and perspective, but Roman, I tended to be a little bit volatile and impulsive, and Roman was always steady, pleasant, balanced. I think we made a good pair. In my case, after that, when I was president, I was at the University of Toronto. But during that period, I think it was during that period that we had a nice demonstration against the Soviet consulate. I forget who came, it was Kosiga or something like that. And I remember Roman at that demonstration being quite combative and we took a little bit of effort to extract them from the circle of the cops, which would be very, very bad for federal civil servant. But what happened then is I left for Europe. And I lived in Glasgow and then in Oxford and then in Paris. Roman eventually came to London and we connected there, and we had our group that was active on political prisoners and this sort of thing, smuggle books to Central Europe and all that. But that was kind of disconnected. And of course, there were a whole other group of people that became active in Susk in the subsequent years and did very good work on political prisoners and other things. But I was living in Paris at that time, and Manoli had organized the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and contacted me and said, would I be interested in a job? And I thought to myself, oh God, that's great. Another Ukrainian thing that I could do. Although I was determined that I'm going to do it for a couple of years and come back to Europe. Well, those couple of years turned out to be 12 or 13 years. And Roman and I were hired at the same time. And it was a pleasure to be with him. I was hired as somebody who was going to focus on Ukraine, because that was what work I would do. That's sort of my expertise. And Roman was to focus on Ukrainian Canadian studies. And it was great. And since both of us were of activist nature, we also got really involved in community work and organizing things in community work. We just couldn't sit still and just kind of sit there and read books and write papers. And those were very, very interesting, dynamic things. So going ahead to some of the questions that you asked, I think Roman's very, very big contribution was to establish on a serious basis the study of the Ukrainian Canadian community. Not just its history, which of course others have done, and subsequently quite a number of Martinovich and all these people like that have done a very lot of good work, and I know there's a lot of good work happening now. But the study of the Ukrainian Canadian community, understanding its contemporary dynamics, and above all, he approached it, and I think that this had something to do with the kind of job that he had in his was working in the federal government, sort of thing, to take a community development approach. Nobody approached the Ukrainian Canadian community as an organ, as a total, and had ideas about this as a micro society, had various components. It needed an educational process. It needed this, that, and the other thing. And he applied that developmental approach. And in fact, that resulted in an event that I thought was one of the best events, was an excellent event, and that was the whole push for that Ukrainian Canadian development plan. I forget what the title of the volume is, but I remember how we labored on writing it. But it was a plan for the community's development over X number of years. That community, the Ukrainian Canadian, we never had that. And this showed what its state is, what its components were, where the weaknesses were, and what it is that one had to do to make it a more resilient and sustainable community. That was also Roman's idea. And he worked with Manoli Lupo. And eventually Roman moved to Grant MacEwan to create the center there. And we continued to be very connected on umpteen number of meetings, umpteen number of initiatives. So we we were neighbors in the Hromada co-op, for example. And I was a very active in COOP at that time, Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and of course, as director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, was constantly speaking about these sorts of things. I had to end my story is that I had a sabbatical leave and I went to Ukraine. I said to do some research, but it was on the eve of independence. I knew that Ukraine would become an independent state. I had written about that. That wasn't to novelty. And I was approached by a couple of people who said, look, put away your books and your research, get involved now, because you can either write about it or you can be part of it. And so I became part of it. And it was a very exciting time. I worked as the head of policy for the Council of Advisors to the Verkhovna Rada, which Bohdan Krawchenko shared, George Soros, Sir Jeffrey Howe, Roman Petryshyn, and we had very interesting times, and I think we made a good contribution. On the eve of the declaration, prepare for the Declaration of Independence, and then state building and nation building, institution building, I should say, rather, institution building in the years subsequent. So that's my story. And by then, of course, I was disconnected with Roman, remained in Edmonton, and continued to do all the good work that he has done.
Thank you so much for that very interesting narrative about your life and how you met Roman and became involved together. I would like to know what one of your most vivid memories are of Roman Petryshyn. And this can be a personal or professional memory, but something that comes to mind is your most vivid memory.
Well, I think first meeting him, I mean, he sits there quietly explaining things. I'm going to offer you a job. And then the gall had the gall to tell me, he says, but there's no money. And he just says this in, in this inimical, quiet way. And I thought, well, that's a bit rich, isn't it? So, yeah, that was, I think, there's nothing like first impression. That first impression really stood out. And actually, it was an experience I repeated many, many times, following this example.
Wonderful. That is very excellent. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit Dr. Roman Petryshyn's work on Ukraine from your perspective, if you have any reflections on his impact on Ukraine.
Well, I mean, he was part of the group as we were sort of growing up in our 20s. That of course had a passionate interest in Ukraine, along with everyone else. But there was a division of labor, and he was very, very concerned about the development of the Ukrainian Canadian community. And I'm very glad that someone did this, because so much of the community had this symbolic concern about Ukraine and did very little to try to develop the community into a vibrant and resilient organ. I think subsequently, Roman had projects in Ukraine. I don't have very much, I met him several times, but I don't really recollect what he did. I think if it was him or somebody else who had this farmers project, I don't know. I can't remember. So I'm afraid that I don't have very much information or experiences of Roman's work in Ukraine, because I was up to my eyeballs into it. things there, and I ended up living there for 15 years. So I really can't comment.
No, that is fair enough. I was going to ask how Dr. Petryshyn's work has strengthened the Ukrainian Canadian community, which you've hit on several points already. If there's anything you'd like to add to what you've already told me, we could add them now. And if you've expressed everything you'd like to express, that's okay as well.
No, you see, as somebody who was sort of, left-wing activist, very concerned about Ukraine and all of that, I became really passionately interested in the fate of the Ukrainian Canadian community. And I got to know it extremely well. I got active in all sorts of things, from organizing a Ukrainian soccer team. I visited, all of the towns in northern Alberta. And I became very, very patriotic about what that community had accomplished. And I think that is a huge that is a huge achievement of Roman, who I think for a whole generation of us made us made us take seriously and passionately committed to the fate of the community there. So, all my kids went to the Ukrainian bilingual program, etc., etc. I think Roman showed how you could be progressive, not a reactionary, liberal thinking, and be comfortable and play a good, important role in your community. He got all kinds of people involved in the Ukrainian Canadian community that were otherwise put off by what you know perfectly well. It used to be, in particular, the kind of dominant nationalist rhetoric. So he has I think he influenced an awful lot of people, and I think that the fact that he, to repeat myself, he held these various conferences, edited books. He put on a more professional basis the study of the Ukrainian Canadian contemporary community, and made that something. When you say, "Oh, I'm doing Ukrainian Canadian studies," people don't say, "Oh yeah, okay," so scoff. For people to take that seriously, and I think that's це його велика заслуга.
Excellent, thank you. That's a wonderful response, and it's wonderful to hear these reflections as well. I have two questions left, one of which is how, you've also touched upon this one, you've done a wonderful overview of my questions, but how has Dr. Petryshyn's work personally impacted you and your career?
It impacted me in my career. I'm not sure how that impacted. Well, it certainly impacted it. It certainly impacted me because, as I told you, apart from somebody who always wanted to focus on Ukraine, I had developed a strong commitment to the Ukrainian community. And also, I should add, and that's very important, is that I took the ideas of multiculturalism that we had advanced, and they were very, 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 very interesting, original, and advanced ideas. And I certainly used this in a lot of work that I had done in Central Europe and all of that. Because the radical proposition that one advanced, especially at those conferences like the Hart House Conference, that the issue of multiculturalism is not just that I'm going to tolerate my neighbor and I'm not going to discriminate, but actually I'm going to help those communities to develop themselves as communities and to develop themselves and develop their culture. And that their culture in time is not exogenous, it's not a foreign culture. it becomes a Canadian culture, like Ukrainian Canadians. I assume it's still there. This kind of Western Ukrainian Canadian country and Western music was its own genre, totally. And so that, I think, if you look at what we said about multiculturalism and you put it to Europe, so you have you have Algerians living in France now for 4 generations. And the big battle is that we shouldn't discriminate against them. Nobody, it doesn't enter into anyone's head to maybe say, well, you know, after 4 or 5, 6 or 7 generations, Algerian is part of French culture. It's an integral part, the whole Maghreb of French culture, and should be recognized and should be funded and supported. So that idea of don't just tolerate me, but help me maintain my identity, that gives me security, is a very pertinent one to this day. And it is bitterly fought in Europe by the right wing, which sees this as a kind of complete undercutting of the old notion that we are the dominant nation, the dominant people, the dominant culture, and everyone else is a guest. Well, so if you're a guest for 200 years, tough luck. Which is not the way Europe developed, which was always had these kinds of influences. So I think that's something that certainly lasts, and is part of your intellectual baggage or your approach and how you see issues. But otherwise, I since 1990, I've had very, very different concerns, first in Ukraine, public administration, public policy, and all of that. And now, of course, an absolutely remarkable journey in Central Asia, which is, that's another story. Anyway, I'm going to Kabul today, so I'll let you know.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And the last question I have is very open-ended, which is just, is there another story you'd like to share with me today, or is there something you'd like to add to the stories that you have already shared?
No, I don't have much to add. He's a very fine person, and he's a good friend and a valued friend. I always felt that he was the guy that you could expect some sober thinking, quiet, and stayed in Edmonton all this time and has made a great contribution.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Krawchenko, for your reflections today. I really appreciate them.